Hello, can you hear me all right? Good, good. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Um, it's a very hard act to follow, but I'll see what I can do. Um, it's very good to see you all. I'm Chris Dowrick. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Liverpool. My background is in primary care. I still work half a day a week as a GP, just about 300 yards from where we live. So I'm a very local GP. Wonderful to be in Copenhagen. I have a few words of Danish, which I shall attempt in a minute. My grandmother was born here, and she taught me that when you have a meal, you say "tak for mouth," and then at the end you say, or the person replying says, "Velbekomme." And she also taught me something I can't remember what it means. It's "Ruth growth mit flavor." Is that red something or other? Okay, that's it. Anyway, so that's my Danish. Um, my the conflicts of interest. I'm doing quite a lot of work with WONCA, the World Organization of Family Doctors, at the moment in training programs on depression for people in low middle income countries. And I've just before I retired, I was getting funding from the National Institute for Health Research for research projects, one of which I'll mention towards the end of this talk. So mitigating the overdiagnosis. So to begin with, this it's a bigger problem, but it's essentially it's a high income country problem. In low and middle income countries, particularly in low income countries, there is still a major problem of underdiagnosis of depression. However, we define depression specifically. I mean, there's a very good paper by Chisholm and colleagues of looking at treatment gap a few years ago, and in low-income countries, perhaps 7% of people who have a depressive disorder who would benefit from treatment are getting that. And there's a large amount of stigma and discrimination, including amongst healthcare providers in many parts of the world. So I'm not saying that this is a universal problem, but it is a problem in high-income countries. Evidence. A paper from several years ago, but it's still valid, looking at primary care consultations, and that GPs, family doctors, were 50% more likely to overdiagnose, to identify a false positive for depression, than correctly identify a case or miss a case in primary care settings. And in the United States specifically, this is clinicians in ambulatory care. Only about a third of clinician diagnosed depression actually met the standard criteria in the US. That it probably would have been DSM-4 at that stage. And of course, that tends to lead to overtreatment, and particularly overtreatment with antidepressant medication. So in the UK, the rates of antidepressant medication have been rising on average 10% every year for the last decade and more, so that in 2020, 17% of Britons were actually prescribed an antidepressant. And long-term antidepressant use is common. In the United States, the median duration is 5 years. When you keep going for a median of 5 years, in the UK it's 2 years. And that's despite the fact that between a third and half of those people, there is no evidence for long-term medication. So it's a problem. Why? Well, I've written about this at length in my book Beyond Depression, still available in good booksellers or online. Three broad reasons. I mean, the place we go to first is pharma, and so it works as a commercial construct in terms of helping pharmaceutical profit margins. Accept that, but it's not just them, it's us as well. Family doctors, Margaret's going to be talking about the speed of a consultation, how we get through it quickly, and we can get through a consultation much more quickly if somebody comes in, yes, depression, blah, 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 put that together, give them some antidepressants. If we're kind, refer them to a counsellor, they're out the door, and then we can go on to think about the next person's hypertension or cholesterol or whatever. So it reduces our uncertainty and it reduces our workload. But we don't just have to shoulder the blame ourselves. I think in societies which most of us inhabit, I think this may be controversial, but it makes sense to me. We have an expectation in our societies of happiness, that we ought to be happy. We ought to be content. Life ought to be good and satisfying. So if it isn't, there's a deviance, there's something wrong. And the easiest thing is 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that would have been a religious problem, and now it's a medical problem. So negative emotional states are deviant and need to be managed in some different way. And I think even more so in our societies in the last small number of years, I think the sense of existential unease which is common to people in many parts of the world, it's reaching our doors now. Whether it's the COVID pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether it's the cataclysmic conflict just a couple of countries away from here. This is stuff that we can no longer say this is the preserve of other people. It's happening to us, and it's affecting us. It's causing unease, not just in our patients, but in ourselves. And all of these things, I think, together sort of make us just more likely to be thinking about depression as a condition when we should really be, I think, thinking more broadly, thinking differently about the sorts of experiences that we have and that our patients are having. So that's the context. So the key questions are, what can we do about it? And so I want to look for a few minutes at diagnostic mitigations and then at therapeutic mitigations. Well, I mean, the first diagnostic mitigation is actually not to make a diagnosis of depression. Just calm down a bit. Just say, well, okay, well, let's just listen. And I haven't put today, but I've been involved in a couple of small qualitative studies recently. One in the north of England, one in New Zealand. The one in the north of England was looking at what patients with a high-ish PHQ score wanted from their GPs. Didn't want a diagnosis. They actually wanted to be listened to. They wanted to be taken seriously, and they wanted to be offered a bit of hope. The one in New Zealand was talking to GPs about what they wanted to do in the first consultation, and actually the thoughtful GPs were less interested in making a diagnosis. They were much more interested in talking with the patient about their function, about how life was going, and what was how their emotional problems were affecting their life. So not necessarily a need for a diagnosis at all. If you want to make a diagnosis, and you may well do, then I suggest you think a bit more broadly, and it's the psychiatric term of making a formulation, which is part of this is some work I was involved with, published last year, the Lancet WPA Commission on depression, where amongst many other really interesting and important things, we were talking about the value of formulation. So you make a diagnosis for sure. But it's not just the symptoms. It's not just the PHQ-9 score. It's also the person's function and how long the symptoms have been going on for. But then also importantly, on top of that, you're asking the patient or the person about their values and their preferences in terms of life, what matters. We had a lovely workshop yesterday about this. I think many of you were there. And then on top of that, perhaps most importantly, their life stories and their circumstances, what's happening, some narrative about why they've got to where they are, the trauma they've experienced, the difficulties they've been having. And then when you put all those things together, you can perhaps begin to work out with the patient some sort of treatment, some sort of help, some sort of management strategy that's going to make a difference to them, that makes sense to them. And then therapeutic mitigations. So a tiny bit of primary care clinical epidemiology. This is from the Diamond cohort study in Victoria, Australia, and it's looking at trajectories of depression and focusing in particular on the bottom light blue line there, which is mild depression. And the most important thing there is this was a study of I can't remember how many practices across the state of Victoria, but there were about, I can't remember, work out the numbers, about 700 or so patients in the study over 12 months. And the most important thing is that the great majority of patients had mild depression. And contrary to popular belief, mild depression stays mild, or indeed gradually gets better over time. So because there's an assumption that you have to treat things early because they get worse. That's not the case. Mild depression stays mild and gradually gets better. A smaller number of people have very severe depression at the top of that graph, and those are associated very strongly with adverse life events and social circumstances, and then there are people in the middle who have fluctuating courses. But the most important bit there is that mild stays mild. So on the basis of that, the same group of people led by Jane Gum produced something called Target D, which is an e-health platform in the GP waiting room with matched management options. So that there was online self-help available for people who had mild depression, online guided psychotherapy for people in the middle scale, and then a more intensive nurse-led collaboration for people at the higher level. And both in terms of clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness, that's a system that works quite well. Standard effect sizes of minus 0.16. Cost effectiveness, that's the health sector cost effectiveness over 80%, and social costs at 3 months were a bit lower, but at 12 months were similar size. So this is a low intensity, low cost, but a targeted system that actually works in terms of reducing symptoms and reducing problems at a decent cost level. And then deprescribing. If we go back to the early slide, loads and loads of people on antidepressants for a very long time for no very good reason. First thing, if we start right at the beginning, a paper we produced in World Psychiatry quite recently, there's quite a lot of evidence, just as a rule of thumb, that in your first consultation, do not prescribe. See the patient again. There may be some occasions when actually you do need to, but generally speaking, if you have that as your first view, first consultation with depression, don't prescribe. Think about it, talk about it, see them again soon. When you do talk about prescribing, right at the beginning, address the patient's fears about what antidepressants may or might do, the expectations, debunk the serotonin hypothesis, which is no longer very valid, and talk about attributions, and talk about the fact that if we're going to do this, we're going to have it for 6 to 9 months, and then we'll gradually wean off. So set the scene more effectively rather than just dishing it out. But then for people who have been on an antidepressant for a while, there are things that we can do to come off safely and effectively. There's been a few studies recently. The one I want to talk about is the REDUCE study that Tony Kendrick from Southampton was leading on. I've been a member of that study team. This is a cluster randomized controlled trial where the key intervention was advice on tapering of antidepressants from family physicians with internet support, both for doctors and for patients. There was different setups for each. 330 patients were involved, and what we found was that more than 40% of patients who were enrolled in the study who were interested in coming off antidepressants, having been on them for about 2 years, more than 40% of people were successfully able to discontinue in both the intervention and the control group. So in terms of the primary outcome, there wasn't a major difference. But there was substantial differences in the secondary outcomes in terms of quality of life, in terms of reduction in depressive symptoms, in terms of well-being and enablement, and again a high probability of cost effectiveness. This study hasn't been published yet. Tony's presented at various conferences, and it's being sent off to a high impact journal. So we've got our fingers crossed about that. So that's the sort of sciencey bit. But the last few minutes, I just want to talk a bit about stuff that's equally dear to my heart, but is not evidence-based in that sense, more sort of experiential things. And to talk first of all about healing relationships, which I think we still have the opportunity, despite all the difficulties in primary care these days, we still have the opportunity of enjoying and exercising these. I think the best primary care consultations can and do enable meaning making and healing, and I think that this is based on the emergence of meaning. And that can be therapeutic in itself, but particularly for people who are feeling lost and lonely and just frightened or misunderstood. And I think that emergence of meaning is mostly probably is only effective if it's mutual, if it's part of a shared mind developing between doctor and patient. And from a therapeutic point of view, I think it's best if it's built on processes which take the events of a life and mold them into a coherent narrative. So that's going back to the bit about formulations, about life circumstances, what's going on, and they're helping the patients to tell stories and seeking more detail, however small, in the reality of the patient's life. Because each detail triggers new scope for the imagination. It renews a possibility of empathy and a chance of the patient feeling heard. And I go back to one of Iona Heath's wonderful phrases that as physicians we have a responsibility to locate hope through the glimpse of an alternative. And then I've been thinking a lot, and this actually fits beautifully with our opening musical session. I've been thinking a lot about how the creative arts can help us as clinicians, as well as our patients. But I'm thinking about us as clinicians here. I've been writing about our engagement with literature. I'm thinking about Tolstoy and Gerard Manley Hopkins, and then more recently I've been thinking about music in terms of two of my favourite people, Beethoven and Bruce Springsteen. I went to see Bruce in Hyde Park a few weeks ago. It was just amazing. But I mean, what's valuable here is the combination of the otherness of what we're reading or listening to, and the brilliance of that piece. It allows us the space and gives us the courage to acknowledge things that are otherwise just it doesn't feel safe to get close to them. So it enables us to turn towards suffering rather than avoid it, to become more curious and then to become more present and engaged. And my final contribution is just to read you a poem by the American poet and Wendell Berry, there's some bits of it on there, but I'm going to read you the whole thing. It's just a few lines. When despair in the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light, and for a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Thank you.